The year was 1789. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, and the task of governing the newly formed United States fell squarely onto the shoulders of its first and only truly indispensable figure, President George Washington. He knew the success of the fragile republic depended entirely on the caliber of his appointments. Assembling his inaugural cabinet, Washington believed he was gathering the nation's most brilliant minds for a unified cause. Instead, he inadvertently placed a ticking time bomb at the heart of the government. The profound, irreconcilable antipathy between his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. The cabinet was ostensibly designed for collaboration, yet it quickly became the principal arena for ideological combat. Hamilton, the sharp, ambitious, and deeply pragmatic former aide-de-camp, saw a future defined by commerce, industry, and a robust, centralized federal government capable of commanding respect both domestically and abroad. His vision was a meritocratic engine fueled by finance, a system requiring national assumption of state debts and the establishment of a powerful national bank. He held a deep skepticism toward the common man and believed that stability required the allegiance of the wealthy elite. Across the cabinet table sat Thomas Jefferson, the lanky, reserved, yet fiercely eloquent champion of the agrarian ideal. Jefferson had returned from his diplomatic post in France, invigorated by the revolutionary spirit he witnessed, and was deeply unsettled by the federalist leanings of the new administration. To him, the strength of America lay not in urban finance, but in the virtuous independent farmer. He feared Hamilton's proposed institutions, the assumption of debts, the bank, as insidious tools that would corrupt the simple virtue of the republic, creating a moneyed aristocracy similar to the one they had just overthrown. Their personalities were as antithetical as their policies. Hamilton was direct, argumentative, and relentless in pushing his agenda through Congress. Jefferson was subtle, working through correspondence and private meetings, often influencing key figures like James Madison to oppose Hamilton's financial programs. Washington, towering over the disputes, tried desperately to maintain harmony, viewing the disagreements as simple matters of administrative detail. He failed to recognize that he was witnessing the birth of America's first political schism. The first major rupture arrived with Hamilton's controversial plan for the federal government to assume the immense war debts of the individual states. To Hamilton, this was essential to establishing national credit and tying the wealthy bondholders to the fate of the Union. To Jefferson and Madison, this was a massive overreach of federal power, rewarding speculators and punishing states like Virginia that had already paid down much of their debt. This singular issue, the nature and scope of federal power, became the crucible for everything that followed. Hamilton was attempting to build a system from scratch, requiring immediate, decisive action. Jefferson believed Hamilton was fundamentally betraying the spirit of the Revolution. This foundational ideological rift, born in the confines of Washington's cabinet, rapidly spilled out into the halls of Congress and eventually, through burgeoning partisan newspapers, reached the American people, irrevocably dividing the political landscape and setting the course for the modern two-party system. The clash between Hamilton and Jefferson in Washington's cabinet transcended mere administrative disputes. It was a fundamental disagreement over the very soul of the American experiment. Both men were dedicated revolutionaries, but they looked at the future of the new republic through completely different lenses, defining two competing visions of prosperity that remain relevant today. One based on the smoky churn of industry, the other on the quiet solitude of the farm. Alexander Hamilton, the immigrant prodigy, harbored a deep distrust of agrarian weakness. He had seen firsthand the inefficiency and fragmentation of the states under the Articles of Confederation. His time in New York, a burgeoning commercial hub, convinced him that national strength was inseparable from economic complexity. His vision was a blueprint for a powerful, centralized state, modeled in part on Great Britain, but purged of monarchy. Hamilton envisioned America as a vibrant, interconnected commercial republic. The manufacturing interest, he argued in his seminal report on manufactures, 1791, is one, on the whole, to which the United States is entitled to pay great attention. He sought to use federal power to stimulate domestic industry through tariffs, bounties, and infrastructure projects. For Hamilton, factories and cities were engines of progress, providing jobs, attracting foreign capital, and ensuring that America would never again be dependent on European powers for essential goods or financial stability. He believed that the concentration of capital and the rise of a professional, educated class were necessary prerequisites for national greatness. Thomas Jefferson, however, saw this urban, industrial future as a profound moral failure. His ideal America was an empire of liberty, a vast landscape settled by virtuous, self-reliant yeoman farmers. To Jefferson, owning land was the true basis of political independence and moral rectitude. He viewed cities as ulcers on the body politic, breeding grounds for corruption, dependency, and the kind of wage slavery that he felt mirrored the tyranny they had just fought to escape. Jefferson believed the true Republican spirit thrived best in the decentralized, natural order of rural life. He famously asserted, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." He feared that Hamilton's financial system, the national bank, the debt assumption, was merely a scheme to enrich speculators and urban elites at the expense of the working majority, inevitably leading to the creation of an aristocracy that would subvert the people's liberty. Where Hamilton saw necessary economic complexity, Jefferson saw dangerous moral compromise. This fundamental ideological chasm soon divided the entire government. When Hamilton introduced his policies, Jefferson and James Madison organized opposition, not just on practical grounds, but on constitutional ones. They argued that the federal government lacked the implied power to charter a bank or actively promote industry, fearing that such expansive interpretations would give the central authority limitless reach. The debate was less about specific policies and more about the ultimate trajectory of the nation. Should America follow the path of commerce and centralization, or remain dedicated to agrarian simplicity and decentralized government? The struggle between Hamilton's manufacturing ideal and Jefferson's agrarian dream was the foundational conflict that crystallized America's first two-party system, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, a division that would define the next generation of American politics and whose echoes resonate in policy debates even today. The most pressing challenge facing the fledgling United States in 1790 was not military, but financial. The war for independence had been won, but the cost was staggering. The nation, both the federal government and the individual states, was saddled with a monumental debt, owed to foreign powers like France and the Netherlands, and more crucially, to thousands of American citizens who had purchased bonds, supplied the army, or simply taken IOUs. National credibility hung by a thread, and without it, the new republic was doomed. Alexander Hamilton, as the Treasury Secretary, saw this immense debt not as a crippling burden, but as a strategic national asset. His solution, unveiled in his first report on public credit, January 1790, was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. The federal government would commit to paying off the entire domestic and foreign debt at face value, and most controversially, would assume the debts incurred by the states during the war. Hamilton's reasoning was purely practical and nationalistic. By taking on the states' liabilities, the federal government would consolidate financial power and, more importantly, compel the nation's wealthiest creditors, the very individuals who held the bonds, to become staunch financial supporters of the new national government. He argued, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." It would serve as permanent capital and a powerful adhesive binding the country together. However, this plan immediately drew the furious opposition of Thomas Jefferson and his ally, James Madison. Their objections were threefold and rooted in their agrarian vision. First, they argued it was an unjust windfall for speculators. During the financially chaotic post-war years, many original bondholders, soldiers and farmers, had been forced by necessity to sell their securities to savvy, often urban, speculators for pennies on the dollar. Hamilton's plan to pay the current holder at face value meant the speculators, not the patriotic original creditors, would reap massive profits. Jefferson saw this as rewarding the corrupt financial class. Second, the assumption of state debts was seen as a massive power grab. States like Virginia and Maryland, having been diligent and fiscally conservative, had already paid down substantial portions of their own debt. Under Hamilton's plan, these responsible states would now be forced to shoulder the debt of less responsible states, like Massachusetts, through federal taxation. To Jefferson and Madison, this was a clear, unconstitutional infringement on state sovereignty and proof of Hamilton's intent to crush local Republican control. The debate in Congress became acrimonious and paralyzing. The government was stalled, threatening to sink the entire Hamiltonian program and possibly the Union itself. Hamilton needed just a few votes to pass the measure. The deadlock was finally broken not in the halls of Congress, but, as the legend goes, over a celebrated private dinner orchestrated by Thomas Jefferson. The solution to the debt dilemma would be found in a political compromise that had nothing to do with finance, but everything to do with geography. By the summer of 1790, the young republic was teetering on the brink of paralysis. Hamilton's essential financial package, the Assumption Bill, the cornerstone of his plan to establish national credit by taking on state debts, was deadlocked in Congress. Northern Federalists supported it wholeheartedly, while Southern Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, viewed it as a constitutional crime against state sovereignty. The debate was so fierce it threatened to splinter the fragile Union just 2 years after its founding. Seeing the political impasse, the frustrated but resourceful Alexander Hamilton turned to his chief opponent, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, for a solution. Jefferson, having just returned from France, initially viewed himself as a nonpartisan figure above the legislative fray. He was a man of letters and diplomacy, not messy backroom politics, but he was about to be drawn into the most consequential political bargain in American history. The crucial meeting took place in late June 1790 at Jefferson's temporary residence in New York. The principals, Hamilton, Jefferson, and James Madison, Hamilton's fiercest legislative, for what Jefferson later described as a gentleman's dinner. Hamilton laid out the stakes plainly. Without the Assumption Bill, the federal government would fail, and the nation would dissolve. He implored Jefferson to use his influence over Madison and the Southern delegation to secure the necessary votes. Jefferson, despite his deep reservations about Hamilton's financial goals, was persuaded by the threat of national disintegration. He understood that the success of the new government under Washington was paramount. He also had a powerful bargaining chip, the location of the permanent national capital. For months, Congress had been debating where the capital should be seated, with fierce competition between sites in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the South, the Potomac River. The Southern delegation desperately wanted the capital closer to their geographic and cultural center, believing it would lend prestige and economic benefit to their region. The famous deal, known simply as the Compromise of 1790, was struck at that dinner. One Hamilton's gain. Jefferson and Madison agreed to rally Southern votes to pass the Assumption Bill, thereby securing Hamilton's entire financial plan. 2. Jefferson's gain. Hamilton agreed to use his influence to ensure that the permanent national capital would be located on the banks of the Potomac River, where Jefferson and Washington wanted it, the future Washington, D.C. As a temporary measure, the capital would remain in Philadelphia for 10 years. The deal was executed swiftly. Madison delivered the Southern votes, and the Assumption Bill passed by a narrow margin. The Residence Act, establishing the capital on the Potomac, also passed shortly thereafter. The political system, momentarily stalled, lurched forward. While the compromise saved Hamilton's economic vision and averted a national crisis, it had a profound and bitter personal consequence. Jefferson felt he had been manipulated. He later wrote that he was duped by Hamilton, believing he had been maneuvered into supporting a policy he viewed as fundamentally damaging to the Republic. The dinner table bargain cemented not only the location of the capital, but also the permanent rupture between the two men. Jefferson would spend the rest of his tenure and presidency fighting to dismantle the very system he had helped, however reluctantly, to enact, turning their intellectual feud into a full-blown political war. With the successful passage of the Assumption Bill, Alexander Hamilton had secured the nation's financial credibility. Yet his grand vision for America's economic future required a second, even more controversial, pillar: a powerful, privately managed national bank. For Hamilton, this was not merely a convenience, but an absolute necessity for a dynamic economy. In December 1790, Hamilton submitted his report on a national bank to Congress. He argued that the Bank of the United States (BUS) would serve several vital functions. It would act as the government's fiscal agent, holding federal deposits and facilitating tax collection. It would provide a stable national currency through the issuance of banknotes. And crucially, it would offer loans to the government and private citizens, stimulating commerce and manufacturing. Hamilton saw the bank as the necessary engine of capital required to transform his agrarian republic into a commercial and industrial power. The bank's structure was designed to appeal to investors while ensuring public interest. It was to be a mixed public-private enterprise, with 80% of its capital coming from private investors and 20% from the federal government. This blend guaranteed that the powerful financial elite would have a vested interest in the success of the federal government, further cementing the Union. The proposal ignited a political firestorm far exceeding the debt assumption debate. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison viewed the national bank as the ultimate federalist overreach, a violation of the spirit of the Constitution and a dangerous concentration of power. Their opposition was rooted in one core principle: constitutional interpretation. Jefferson and Madison argued that the Constitution nowhere explicitly granted Congress the power to charter a bank. They championed the doctrine of strict construction, asserting that the federal government could only exercise powers expressly listed in the Constitution, enumerated powers, or those strictly necessary to carry out those enumerated powers. Since Congress was not explicitly given the power to create a bank, Jefferson concluded, the act was unconstitutional and therefore null and void. Jefferson warned President Washington that the bank was an act of subversion that would swallow up the powers reserved to the states and the people, leading to a system where the legislative and executive branches could claim any power they wished under the guise of necessity. Hamilton responded with the famous doctrine of implied powers or loose construction. He pointed to the necessary and proper clause, Article I, Section 8, which grants Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for executing its enumerated powers, such as collecting taxes, regulating commerce, and borrowing money. Hamilton argued that, while the power to create a bank was not explicitly named, it was a logical and necessary means to effectively carry out the government's financial duties. The power to collect taxes implied the power to create a safe place to deposit them, and the power to regulate commerce implied the power to create a uniform currency. The fate of the bank and the fundamental nature of federal power was placed directly before President Washington. He requested written opinions from both his secretaries. Hamilton's defense was brilliant, convincing Washington that the bank was constitutional under the doctrine of implied powers. In February 1791, Washington signed the bill, chartering the first national bank for 20 years. The immediate victory belonged to Hamilton, who had cemented his financial system and established a crucial precedent for expansive federal power. However, the resulting rift over strict V's. Loose construction had established the deepest fault line in American politics, leading directly to the formation of the nation's first political parties, and ensuring that the debate over the limits of federal authority would endure for centuries. Alexander Hamilton's financial plan, built on the twin pillars of debt assumption and the national bank, required a stable source of revenue. In 1791, Congress, at Hamilton's insistence, passed an excise tax on distilled spirits, the infamous whiskey tax. While seemingly a benign financial measure, this tax ignited a violent firestorm on the western frontier, becoming the first great internal crisis of the American Republic, and the proving ground for Hamilton's vision of robust federal power. For the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and the backcountry, the tax was an existential threat and a deep moral offense. Grain, primarily rye and barley, was their main crop, but it was perishable and costly to transport over the Appalachian Mountains. Distilling that grain into whiskey, an easily transported, non-perishable, and highly valuable commodity, was not a luxury. It was a basic economic necessity and a form of frontier currency. The tax, payable only in cash, disproportionately harmed these small, cash-poor Western distillers, while larger Eastern producers were better equipped to absorb the cost. The frontiersmen viewed the tax as another act of tyranny, echoing the Stamp Act and other resented British taxes. A clear indication that the new government, seated far away in Philadelphia, was dominated by Eastern, commercial interests. Resistance was swift and brutal. Federal revenue officers attempting to collect the tax were threatened, harassed, beaten, and often subjected to the humiliating colonial ritual of tarring and feathering. The conflict reached its violent climax in July 1794, when an armed mob of hundreds of rebels, calling themselves the Whiskey Boys, attacked the fortified home of tax inspector John Neville near Pittsburgh. The violence threatened to spread throughout the western counties, with some voices demanding secession from the Union. The structure of the federal government itself hung in the balance. If the central authority could not enforce its own laws, it would be no stronger than the failed Articles of Confederation. Alexander Hamilton saw this as an opportunity, a fortunate crisis, to demonstrate the government's power. He urged President Washington to meet the rebellion with overwhelming force, arguing that leniency would be seen as weakness. Washington, though reluctant, eventually agreed. Drawing upon the Militia Acts of 1792, he federalized the militias of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, assembling a massive army of nearly 13,000 men, a force larger than the one he commanded during most of the Revolutionary War. In a move unprecedented in American history, President Washington personally rode at the head of the troops, accompanied by Hamilton, into the rebellious counties of western Pennsylvania. The sheer show of force was decisive. Facing a professional army led by the sitting president, the opposition melted away. While only 2 men were eventually convicted of treason, both later pardoned by Washington, the government's message was clear. Dissent through the ballot box was tolerated, but armed resistance to federal law would be crushed. Thomas Jefferson, witnessing the massive military deployment, was utterly appalled. He saw the expedition as a dangerous, unnecessary, and tyrannical display of force against patriotic Americans, arguing that the threat had been grossly exaggerated by Hamilton for political gain. For Jefferson, the Whiskey Rebellion campaign confirmed his deepest fears. Hamilton's policies were leading the nation toward an aristocracy backed by a standing army, forever compromising the liberty of the yeoman farmer and the purity of the Republican ideal. The response to the rebellion hardened the political lines, accelerating the formation of the Federalist Party, pro-enforcement, and the Democratic Republican Party, pro-agrarian rights into permanent institutions. Having established the nation's credit, through assumption and its fiscal machinery, through the National Bank, Alexander Hamilton completed his trifecta of economic statecraft with his report on manufactures, presented to Congress in December 1791. This was Hamilton's ultimate intellectual and policy statement, defining his vision for America's path to power, a path fundamentally opposed to Jefferson's agrarian ideal. The report was a thorough, 11-volume economic treatise, arguing that the wealth and security of the United States depended not merely on farming, but on the active promotion and protection of domestic industry. Hamilton challenged the prevailing economic orthodoxy of the time, physiocracy, which held that only agriculture created real wealth. He countered that manufacturing was a superior source of national strength for several key reasons. First, manufacturing offered a greater diversity of labor. Hamilton argued that industrial jobs provided employment for classes of people who might otherwise be idle, such as women and children, thereby increasing the overall productivity of the nation. Second, factories fostered technological innovation and the use of machinery, increasing output far beyond what manual labor could achieve. Third, domestic manufacturing would create economic independence, ensuring that America would not be held hostage by foreign nations, particularly Great Britain, for essential military and consumer goods. To facilitate this industrial transformation, Hamilton proposed an ambitious suite of federal policies: protective tariffs, high taxes on imported manufactured goods to make foreign products more expensive, encouraging Americans to buy domestically produced items, subsidies, bounties, direct financial payments from the government to specific nascent American industries to help them overcome initial production costs and competition, infrastructure, federal investment in roads, canals, and waterways to link industrial centers with sources of raw materials and markets. This proposal crystallized the ideological war between the two titans. For Hamilton, these measures were practical steps toward creating a powerful, sophisticated, self-sufficient nation. He was laying the foundation for modern American capitalism, where the government actively intervened to steer the economy and protect its industrial interests. To Thomas Jefferson, however, the report on manufactures was the final, undeniable proof of Hamilton's betrayal of the Republican ideal. Jefferson saw the proposed tariffs and subsidies as mechanisms to transfer wealth from the agricultural South to the manufacturing North. He believed that the system would create a vast underclass of dependent factory workers, severed from the land and therefore politically corruptible, making them easy prey for tyrants and demagogues. The vision of dense, polluted cities filled with factory workers was an anathema to his ideal of the independent, virtuous farmer. Jefferson's opposition was absolute. He believed that government intervention should be minimal and focused entirely on protecting individual liberty, not promoting corporate enterprise. He feared that protective tariffs would lead to international trade wars, and that federal bounties were an unconstitutional abuse of the Treasury. Though Congress adopted parts of the tariff recommendations, Hamilton's full vision, especially the direct subsidies, was blocked by the strong Southern and agrarian opposition rallied by Jefferson and Madison. Nonetheless, the report on manufactures became the foundational text for American industrial policy for the next century, providing the intellectual justification for Henry Clay's American system and every subsequent era of protectionism. While Hamilton himself did not live to see the full industrial blossoming of the United States, this report irrevocably defined America's destiny as an economic powerhouse, a victory for his vision over Jefferson's agrarian dream. The continuous conflict over Hamilton's financial program, the bank, the debt assumption, the excise tax, and the reports on manufactures, was ultimately not about economics, but about the very structure and limits of federal authority. This central legal dispute became known as the division between strict construction and loose construction of the U.S. Constitution, a schism that defined the political parties and endures in American jurisprudence to this day. Strict construction was the doctrine championed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Their view held that the federal government could only exercise powers explicitly granted to it by the text of the Constitution, or those powers that were absolutely essential to carry out one of the enumerated powers. They based their argument primarily on the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people. For Jefferson, limiting the federal government to the expressly delegated powers was the only safeguard against tyranny. He viewed any expansion beyond the literal text as a dangerous path toward an all-powerful, centralized government that would inevitably erode state sovereignty and individual liberty. When Hamilton proposed the national bank, Jefferson led the charge, arguing that the Constitution gave Congress the power to collect taxes, but not the power to charter a corporation like a bank. To do so, in his view, was an unconstitutional act of usurpation. Loose construction, championed by Alexander Hamilton, was the counterargument that ultimately won the day and reshaped the nature of American governance. Hamilton argued that the government must have the inherent capacity to adapt to changing circumstances to govern effectively. He found his legal justification in two key clauses of the Constitution. One, the General Welfare Clause, which allows Congress to tax and spend for the general welfare. Two, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which grants Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for executing its enumerated powers. Hamilton argued that necessary did not mean absolutely essential, but rather convenient or appropriate. His famous defense of the national bank to President Washington asserted that since the Constitution gave the government the power to collect taxes, regulate commerce, and borrow money, enumerated powers, the power to create a bank, an implied power was a necessary and proper means to effectively carry out those tasks. The difference was monumental. If Jefferson's strict construction prevailed, the federal government would be severely restricted, incapable of proactive policy making, and perpetually subservient to the states, a nation resembling the weak confederation that had preceded it. If Hamilton's loose construction prevailed, the federal government gained an elastic legal basis to create powerful institutions, promote economic development, and establish a firm national identity. President Washington ultimately sided with Hamilton, signing the National Bank Act and establishing the precedent of implied powers. This victory was a defining moment. It meant that the federal government would possess the flexibility to grow and address future crises. However, for Jefferson, it confirmed the existence of a betrayal. The constitutional debate transformed into the definitive political battleground, forcing politicians to choose sides and permanently hardening the lines between the nascent Federalist Party, pro-loose construction, strong central government, and the Democratic Republican Party, pro-strict construction, limited government, ensuring that the argument over who holds the power would define American politics for centuries to come. While the cabinet fought over banks and taxes at home, a cataclysmic event across the Atlantic, the French Revolution, ripped the nascent American political system in two and brought the Hamilton-Jefferson feud to its absolute boiling point. The question of how to respond to revolutionary France became the defining diplomatic war of the 1790s. When the French Revolution began in 1789, it was initially welcomed by nearly all Americans as a triumph of liberty, inspired by their own struggle. However, as the revolution descended into the radical violence of the Reign of Terror 1793, culminating in the execution of King Louis XVI, American opinion fractured along partisan lines already etched by the Hamilton-Jefferson rivalry. Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans remained steadfastly pro-French. They viewed France's struggle as a continuation of America's own, a fight against monarchy and aristocracy. They saw the 1778 Franco-American treaties, which pledged mutual defense, as still binding, and they celebrated the revolutionary government, often wearing cockades and holding grand fêtes. Jefferson saw France as the necessary counterweight to America's old enemy, Great Britain. Alexander Hamilton and his Federalists were profoundly alarmed. The violence and mass executions confirmed Hamilton's deepest fears about radical democracy and the instability of the common man. He viewed the French government as anarchic and dangerous. More pragmatically, Hamilton knew that American economic survival depended on trade with Great Britain, which was now at war with France. To honor the 1778 treaty would instantly drag the United States into a devastating war with the nation that supplied 90% of America's imports. The crisis came to a head in April 1793 with the arrival of citizen Edmond Jenner, the new French minister to the United States. Jenner, rather than presenting his credentials politely, immediately began commissioning private American ships, privateers to attack British shipping, and tried to enlist American citizens to fight for France. He was essentially treating the neutral U.S. as a French military base, openly appealing to the American public over the head of President Washington. Washington, guided by Hamilton's counsel, understood that the nation was too weak and financially fragile to risk war. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in April 1793, declaring that the United States would be friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers. This decision was celebrated by the Federalists as an act of courageous realism, but was instantly and fiercely denounced by the Republicans. Jefferson believed the president had exceeded his constitutional authority by unilaterally declaring foreign policy. He was infuriated that Washington's administration had effectively abandoned America's only true ally in favor of its old oppressor, Britain. Though he remained in the cabinet for a few more months, Jefferson's position became untenable. He was secretly providing advice to Madison and other critics who were openly attacking the administration's policy, and his relationship with Washington was strained beyond repair. The diplomatic wars of 1793, epitomized by the Jenner affair and the Proclamation of Neutrality, confirmed the irreconcilable differences. Hamilton prioritized order, finance, and pragmatic neutrality, while Jefferson prioritized ideological purity, Republican solidarity, and democratic liberty. Ultimately, Washington and Hamilton won the diplomatic battle, keeping the nation out of a ruinous war and ensuring its economic survival through British trade. But the cost was the final destruction of cabinet unity, leading directly to Jefferson's resignation at the end of 1793 and the permanent alignment of American political life into two warring, ideology-driven parties. By the mid-1790s, the political battle between Hamilton and Jefferson had spilled out of the government halls and into the public square, fought with a ferocious new weapon, the partisan press. With no mass media aside from newspapers, these publications became the primary instruments for political organizing, attack, and character assassination, transforming the rivalry into a national spectacle of slander. Thomas Jefferson and his allies, recognizing the need to counter Hamilton's influence over the few existing Federalist-leaning papers, actively sponsored opposition journalists. The most notable of these was Philip Freneau, whom Jefferson hired as a translator for the State Department, effectively subsidizing his newspaper, the National Gazette. Freneau's paper became the official mouthpiece of the Democratic-Republican cause, relentlessly attacking Hamilton's policies, his financial system, and even his personal integrity under pseudonyms. Hamilton's Federalists had their own champions, most prominently John Freneau's Gazette of the United States. These papers viciously counterattacked, labeling Jefferson a dangerous Democrat, an anarchist who was secretly working to dissolve the Union and align America with revolutionary French terror. The language used by both sides was often crude, personal, and utterly unrestrained, establishing a tradition of media hyperpartisanship that defined the era. The purpose of this media war was not just to debate policy, but to destroy the political credibility of the opposing leaders. However, this private war erupted into the most damaging public scandal of the decade, the Reynolds Affair, which directly targeted Alexander Hamilton. In 1797, 3 Republican journalists, including James T. Callender, who would later publish damaging material against Jefferson as well, publicly accused Hamilton of engaging in illegal financial speculation while he was Treasury Secretary. They alleged he had used his official position to help a man named James Reynolds and profit from secret government dealings. Hamilton, recognizing that the accusation of financial corruption would irrevocably destroy his entire economic legacy, faced a terrible choice. He had to prove he was guilty of a private moral offense to clear his name of the public crime of financial malfeasance. In a move of staggering, self-destructive candor, Hamilton published what is known as the Reynolds pamphlet. In it, he confessed to an adulterous affair with Maria Reynolds, James Reynolds' wife, that had taken place 6 years earlier. Hamilton explained that the payments he made to James Reynolds were not hush money for financial conspiracy, but blackmail payments to maintain secrecy regarding the affair. While the pamphlet cleared Hamilton's name of the official corruption charge, the public and political fallout was immense. The scandal ruined his reputation and effectively ended his public career, forever tarnishing the image of the architect of American finance. For the Democratic Republicans, it was a massive political victory. Hamilton was publicly disgraced, neutralizing his power base. Thomas Jefferson, while claiming he had nothing to do with the initial charges, benefited immensely from the affair's outcome. The use of partisan newspapers, fueled by scandal and personal intrigue, demonstrated that character, or the destruction of it, was as vital a weapon as any constitutional argument in the bitter feud that shaped the dawn of American politics. The Reynolds Affair cemented the era of political combat defined by smear and scandal, leaving the field open for the rise of Jefferson and the Republican Party. The clash between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson was not merely a rivalry between two brilliant individuals. It was the crucible in which the fundamental, enduring disagreement over American governance was forged. By the mid-1790s, the ideological fissures within George Washington's cabinet had hardened into the nation's first 2 distinct and organized political factions, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Washington himself had warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party in his farewell address, viewing political division as a threat to the fragile Union. However, the irreconcilable differences in the philosophies of Hamilton and Jefferson made the formation of parties inevitable. The issues, finance, constitutional interpretation, and foreign policy, were simply too fundamental to be solved by compromise. The Federalists, the Federalist Party coalesced around Hamilton's central vision of a strong, centralized commercial republic. Their core tenets included constitutional interpretation, advocated for loose construction, using the necessary and proper clause to expand federal power in order to act efficiently and decisively. Economic vision, believed in promoting American manufacturing, banking, and commerce through federal intervention, tariffs, the national bank. They prioritized the interests of merchants, financiers, and New England industrialists. Foreign policy, strongly favored Great Britain as an essential trading partner and a bastion of order and stability, deeply mistrusting the radicalism of revolutionary France. Political philosophy, distrusted radical democracy and the passions of the common man. They favored rule by the best men, the educated and wealthy elite, to ensure stability and national solvency. The Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republican Party, often simply called Republicans in this era, formed as a direct opposition to Hamilton's system, unifying around the principles championed by Jefferson and James Madison. Their core tenets were constitutional interpretation, advocated for strict construction, reserving maximum power for the states and restricting the federal government to its explicitly enumerated powers. Economic vision, prioritized the agrarian ideal, believing the virtuous independent farmer was the foundation of the republic. They opposed the national bank, centralized debt, and federal subsidies for manufacturers. Foreign policy. Fiercely pro-French, seeing France as a sister republic fighting the same battles against aristocracy and monarchy. They viewed British influence as the greatest threat to American liberty. Political philosophy. Championed the rights of the states and the masses. They believed in a more participatory democracy and saw federalist policies as an attempt to re-establish an American aristocracy. The establishment of these parties was solidified by local political organizations, state committees, and the partisan press, which served as powerful tools for mobilization. The Federalists dominated the early years, securing the presidency for Washington and John Adams. However, the Democratic Republicans, effectively utilizing the burgeoning press and appealing to the expansive population of Western and Southern farmers, steadily gained ground. This definitive split ensured that politics would never again be merely an arrangement of individuals. It became a contest of organized ideologies. The Revolution of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson finally defeated the Federalist incumbent John Adams, demonstrated the power of this new party system. It marked the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to its opposition in modern history, validating the new party structure. The legacy of the feud is that every major American debate over the size of government, the role of finance and foreign alliances, has been fought along the lines first drawn by Hamilton and Jefferson. Their struggle transformed American politics from a polite, elite consensus into a competitive, ideology-driven democracy. By 1796, George Washington, weary from 8 tumultuous years in office and profoundly discouraged by the relentless political warfare that had fractured his cabinet, decided he would not seek a third term. His departure was a seismic event. He was the only figure universally revered by all factions, and his stepping down established the two-term limit precedent that governed the presidency for over 140 years. Washington's last great act of public service was his farewell address, first published in a Philadelphia newspaper in September 1796. While the words were Washington's own, the document was the result of a profound collaboration with Alexander Hamilton, who substantially edited and drafted much of the final text. This co-authorship cemented the final, ideological alignment of Washington's administration firmly with the Federalist perspective. The farewell address served as Washington's final warning to the American people, and its content directly addressed the destructive forces he had witnessed tearing the country apart, forces unleashed by the Hamilton-Jefferson schism. First and foremost, the address issued a powerful condemnation of partisan politics. Washington, echoing his disgust with the Federalist-Republican battles, warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. He argued that factions fostered revenge, created unnecessary jealousies, and ultimately opened the door to foreign manipulation, leading toward despotism. This was a direct, final critique of the political machine Jefferson and Hamilton had effectively built. Second, and equally central to the Federalists' worldview, was the warning against permanent foreign alliances. Washington urged the nation to observe good faith and justice toward all nations, but to avoid permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others. This was a clear endorsement of the policy of neutrality, which Hamilton had championed against the Republicans' passionate desire to align with revolutionary France. It was a victory for pragmatic economic stability over ideological solidarity. The influence of the farewell address was immediate and partisan. Federalists embraced it as a sacred text, embodying the wisdom of the nation's founder and validating their political platform. They used it to campaign against the Democratic Republicans, portraying them as dangerous, factionalized, and too closely tied to French radicalism. Conversely, the Democratic Republicans, while honoring Washington the man, fiercely rejected the underlying politics of the address. They saw the warning against factions as a hypocritical attack, given that Hamilton, the leader of the Federalist Party, had helped draft the document. They interpreted the warning against permanent alliances as a final act of appeasement toward Great Britain and a betrayal of the 1778 French treaty. The result of the farewell address was not reconciliation, but further division. Washington stepped down, but the ideological chasm he had attempted to bridge remained unhealed. The subsequent election of 1796 became the first truly contested presidential election in American history, pitting John Adams, Federalist, against Thomas Jefferson, Democratic-Republican. Adams narrowly won, making him president, but Jefferson, as the runner-up, became vice president. The nation was now led by a president and vice president who were the leaders of warring political factions and who fundamentally despised each other's vision for the country. A final, painful legacy of the unhealed rift left by the feud that drove Washington out of office. The precedent of stepping down was set, but the precedent of political hostility was cemented. The election of 1800, which Thomas Jefferson famously termed the Revolution of 1800, marked the high point of the Democratic-Republican triumph. After a decade of bitter political combat against the Federalists, Jefferson ascended to the presidency with a clear mandate: to restore the Republic to its original agrarian principles, slash the national debt, limit the scope of federal authority, and dismantle the centralized financial architecture built by Alexander Hamilton. He promised a nation where government would govern least, allowing for his cherished empire of liberty to flourish, a decentralized nation of independent, virtuous farmers. Yet Jefferson's 8 years in office, 1801-1809, became the great irony of the Hamilton-Jefferson feud. While his rhetoric remained fiercely anti-federalist, his successful governance proved just how essential Hamilton's foundational infrastructure was to the stability and expansion of the United States. Jefferson inherited a government where the credit was sound, the debt was being systematically managed, and a revenue stream, the tariffs and excise taxes, was reliably collected, all thanks to the system he had vehemently opposed. Upon taking office, Jefferson faced a pivotal choice regarding the two most hated Hamiltonian institutions, the National Bank and the assumption of state debts. Despite his earlier constitutional arguments, Jefferson and his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, reluctantly chose to keep the National Bank. Its functions, providing stable currency, facilitating loans, and managing the Treasury, were too integral to the nation's smooth operation to simply abolish. The government ran smoothly because the Hamiltonian infrastructure was fundamentally sound. Jefferson was forced to be pragmatic. He might dislike the bank's existence, but he could not govern without its services. The most spectacular contradiction between Jefferson's limited government philosophy and his actual policy came in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon offered the entire Louisiana Territory to the U.S. for $15 million. A tract of land so vast it would secure the future of Jefferson's agrarian empire of liberty for generations. The purchase was a dream realized, promising endless farmland for his beloved yeoman farmers. However, the power to purchase foreign territory was nowhere explicitly granted to the President or Congress in the Constitution. Jefferson, the lifelong advocate of strict construction, knew this act was a massive expansion of executive power. He privately confessed that the transaction was without authority from the Constitution. Yet the opportunity was too monumental to let pass. In a move that mirrored Hamilton's flexibility, Jefferson effectively used the same loose construction, implied powers argument he had condemned a decade earlier to authorize the purchase. To pay for this massive acquisition, Jefferson was forced to issue new federal bonds, a fundamental component of Hamilton's despised financial system. The funds were ultimately handled through the National Bank, the institution whose constitutionality Jefferson had fought with all his might. In the end, Jefferson's Revolution of 1800 resulted in the permanent establishment of a flexible, commercially oriented federal government. He successfully reduced the Army and Navy, cut some taxes, and promoted westward expansion. Yet the foundations that allowed him to govern successfully, the robust federal credit, the National Bank, and the acceptance of implied powers necessary to expand the nation, were the enduring and undeniable legacy of his great rival, Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson ruled the empire, but he had to use Hamilton's tools to build it. By the early 1800s, Alexander Hamilton, though retired from public office and disgraced by the Reynolds affair, remained the intellectual powerhouse and de facto leader of the Federalist Party. He practiced law in New York, while Thomas Jefferson occupied the presidency and slowly but surely consolidated Republican power. Though their direct combat had ceased, Hamilton still wielded significant influence, often using it to thwart the political ambitions of his enemies, a move that would ultimately cost him his life. Hamilton's fatal conflict was not with Jefferson, but with a third powerful figure in the political landscape, Aaron Burr, Jefferson's brilliant but erratic vice president. In the fiercely contested 1800 election, Burr and Jefferson had tied in the Electoral College, forcing the decision into the House of Representatives. Hamilton, despite his profound personal hatred for Jefferson, viewed Burr as morally bankrupt and politically dangerous, famously labeling him the most unfit and dangerous man for the presidency. Hamilton threw his influence behind Jefferson, ensuring his rival won the presidency and condemning Burr to the vice presidency. This intervention earned Burr's lasting enmity. The feud festered, and in 1804, when Burr ran for governor of New York and Hamilton once again successfully undermined his campaign, Burr's patience snapped. Burr demanded satisfaction for what he considered Hamilton's despicable opinion against him, leading to the challenge of a duel. On the morning of July 11, 1804, the two men met across the Hudson River on a secluded ledge in Weehawken, New Jersey, the very place where Hamilton's eldest son, Philip, had been killed in a duel 3 years earlier defending his father's honor. Hamilton, opposing the practice of dueling on moral and religious grounds, famously declared his intent to discharge his pistol harmlessly into the air, fulfilling the social code without committing murder. What exactly transpired remains debated, but the outcome was tragically clear. Burr's bullet struck Hamilton in the abdomen. He was rowed back across the river, agonizing for 30 hours before he died on July 12, 1804 at the age of 49. The death of Alexander Hamilton sent shockwaves across the nation. He was mourned by thousands, even by some of his Republican adversaries, as the great architect of the nation's economic and constitutional system. Aaron Burr, now a political pariah, saw his own political career effectively ended, forever marked by the shame of killing one of the founding fathers. The tragedy marked the end of Hamilton the man, but not the end of his vision. In a twist of destiny, Hamilton's death actually solidified the continuation of his system. With Hamilton gone, the Federalist Party quickly disintegrated, unable to function without its towering leader. This left the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, in complete political control. Ironically, the Federalist absence meant that there was no organized opposition to challenge the use of Hamiltonian institutions. When the War of 1812 revealed America's need for a stronger financial apparatus, even the Republicans embraced Federalist principles. They chartered a second national bank, continued to use tariffs, and invested in internal improvements. Hamilton's final destiny was to lose his life at the hands of a political rival, but his system, the belief in a strong, flexible federal government, a national financial structure, and a path toward industrial growth, was absorbed by the very party that had fought him for a decade. The principles he laid down in the 1790s survived his tragic death and became the default operating system for the United States, proving more resilient than the man himself. 2 centuries have passed since Alexander Hamilton was felled by Aaron Burr's bullet, and Thomas Jefferson retired to Monticello. Yet the battle lines they drew in the 1790s remain the fundamental, defining fault lines of modern American political and economic debate. The Hamilton-Jefferson schism is not a relic of history. It is the core operating conflict of the United States. Every major policy discussion in contemporary America, from the size of government to the nature of the economy, can be traced back to the original rivalry, centralized power versus decentralized liberty. The legacy of Alexander Hamilton is evident in the institutions that govern the modern economy and the view that federal action is essential for national prosperity. When modern politicians argue for government investment in infrastructure, manufacturing subsidies, or targeted industrial policies to compete with global rivals, they are channeling Hamilton. The entire apparatus of the modern U.S. financial system, the Federal Reserve, the expansive Treasury Department, and the power of federal taxation, are direct descendants of his foundational reports. Hamilton's spirit lives in the belief that a strong, adaptable federal government is necessary to ensure stability, protect property, and promote the general welfare through economic growth. Conversely, the legacy of Thomas Jefferson resonates fiercely in modern calls for limited government, states' rights, and skepticism toward centralized authority. When political movements advocate for lower taxes, minimal federal regulation of business, or the decentralization of power away from Washington, D.C., They are invoking the spirit of Jeffersonian republicanism. His philosophy fuels the enduring American distrust of elites, large financial institutions, and the notion that political power naturally corrupts individual liberty. The debates over privacy, gun control, and the scope of individual freedoms often employ the same strict construction arguments Jefferson used against the national bank. The tension manifests most acutely in the current political landscape. One side, often associated with the Democratic Party, sees the government as Hamilton did, an active, necessary agent for solving national problems, regulating the excesses of capitalism, and ensuring a robust social safety net. The other side, often associated with the Republican Party, argues from a Jeffersonian position that the government is inherently wasteful and prone to tyranny, and that economic and social well-being are best fostered by maximizing individual liberty and restricting federal reach. Even the geographic and economic divides mirror the original split. The financial centers and industrial hubs, the Hamilton vision, often clash with the rural, resource-based economies, the Jefferson vision, over issues like environmental regulation, trade tariffs, and farm subsidies. The final, enduring relevance of the schism is its demonstration that the American system is designed not for consensus, but for constant, creative tension. The nation needs both visions: Hamilton's powerful, stable engine of commerce and defense, and Jefferson's fierce, moral insistence on liberty and democratic accountability. The political history of the United States is essentially a continuous pendulum swing between the pragmatic centralization of Hamilton and the democratic decentralization of Jefferson. The bitter feud that defined the founding cabinet remains, 2 centuries later, the enduring heartbeat of American democracy.